Before anything around you ever changed, something within you was meant to change first. Because the greatest battleground has never been the world outside of you, but the mind within you. What you see is not determined by your eyes alone, but by what your heart has been trained to recognize. Two people can stand in the same place, witness the same moment, face the same storm, yet one sees chaos, and the other sees the fingerprints of God. Why? Because one has trained the mind to see beyond the visible. From the beginning, God has been speaking not only through prophets and pages, but through patterns, through moments, through interruptions, through silence, through loss, and through blessing. He hides revelation in the ordinary, eternity in the everyday, and purpose in what seems random. But the untrained mind calls it coincidence, while the awakened mind calls it divine. If you only look for God in the extraordinary, you will miss Him in the very places He promised to dwell. He is not only in the miracle, but in the process. Not only in the answer, but in the waiting. Not only in the breakthrough, but in the breaking. To train your mind to see God in everything is to step into a higher way of living where nothing is wasted, nothing is meaningless, and nothing is accidental. Tonight, this is not just about changing what you see, but transforming how you see. Because when your mind is trained to recognize God in all things, fear loses its power, confusion loses its voice, and even the darkest moments begin to reveal divine purpose. The house has always been more than walls and ceilings, more than doors and windows, more than a place where you sleep and eat and rest, because from the beginning of time, God has chosen houses as meeting points between heaven and earth, as altars hidden in plain sight, as places where the ordinary life of humanity collides with the extraordinary purposes of God. And you must understand this first, or you will miss what is unfolding, because the greatest movements of God rarely announce themselves with thunder. They arrive quietly, subtly, often disguised as routine, arriving on a day that looks like every other day, at an hour that feels familiar, in a house that seems unchanged, yet today is marked. Today is separated. Today is different, because something has been set in motion that cannot be reversed. There are days that pass, and then there are days that are appointed, and an appointed day does not ask for permission. It does not wait for readiness. It arrives because heaven has already decided. And what is about to happen in your house today is not the result of chance, timing, or coincidence, but the result of alignment, because unseen hands have been arranging circumstances, shifting delays, closing certain paths, opening others, all to bring you to this very moment, in this very place, under this very word. And the danger is not that nothing will happen. The danger is that something will happen and you will explain it away, dismiss it, or overlook it because it did not come the way you expected. In Scripture, houses were places of visitation, not because of their size or beauty, but because of what God chose to do within them. A house became a sanctuary. A house became a place of judgment and mercy. A house became a doorway to destiny. And what changed was never the structure. It was the atmosphere. Because when God enters a space, the air shifts, the unseen order rearranges, and things that have been stagnant suddenly become active. Things that were silent begin to speak, and things that were dormant begin to awaken. And the reason many miss it is because they are waiting for a sign outside, while God is working inside. Today, something will cross the threshold of your house, not physically as flesh and bone, but spiritually as movement, as stirring, as awareness, as conviction, as clarity. Because God often begins by changing what you perceive before He changes what you possess. And the first evidence that something has happened is not that your circumstances shift, but that your discernment sharpens, that your spirit becomes alert, that your heart senses weight where there was once emptiness. Because when heaven touches earth, the soul recognizes it before the mind can explain it. You must understand that houses remember, walls witness, spaces hold echoes of prayers spoken and prayers withheld, of words declared and words feared, and today is not disconnected from what has been spoken in your house before, because prayers you forgot, prayers whispered, prayers cried out in desperation, prayers spoken when no one was listening have not expired. They have been stored, and today activates something that has been waiting for the right moment to manifest. Because God does not forget what was asked in faith, even when faith grew tired. There are things in your house that have been out of order, not physically, but spiritually, patterns that repeated, tensions that lingered, heaviness that seemed unexplainable. And what happens today is not random, it is corrective, because God is a God of order, and when He enters, He begins to realign what drifted, to expose what was hidden, to confront what was tolerated. And this is why not every visitation feels comfortable, because light does not negotiate with darkness, it reveals it. And when revelation enters a house, excuses lose their strength. Do not assume that what happens today must be loud to be real, because some of the most powerful shifts happen in silence, in a moment of realization, in a sudden peace that does not match the situation, in a clarity that arrives without explanation, because the kingdom of God often advances quietly, like leaven working through dough, unseen yet unstoppable, and once it begins, it does not reverse. Your house today becomes a place of decision, because whenever God moves, response is required, neutrality dissolves, hesitation becomes visible, and what you choose to do with what is revealed determines what remains. Because God does not force transformation, He invites participation, and what He initiates today awaits your agreement to continue. Understand this carefully. Not every door that opens today will be external. Some doors open within. Doors of understanding, doors of repentance, doors of faith, doors of courage. And when an internal door opens, life begins to follow, because change always starts inside before it manifests outside, and the house becomes the first witness of that shift. Today is not about tomorrow, and it is not about yesterday. It is about now, because now is when heaven intersects time. Now is when instruction is given. Now is when alignment happens. Now is when what was delayed meets readiness. And your house today stands at that intersection, whether you recognize it or not. What happens in your house today may not make sense immediately. It may raise questions. It may disrupt routines. It may challenge assumptions. But disruption is often the evidence of divine activity, because God disrupts what confines in order to release what fulfills. And when He does, the familiar is never quite the same again. This is why attention matters today, because what you ignore fades, what you acknowledge grows, and what you honor remains, and your awareness becomes the doorway through which more is allowed to enter, because heaven responds to recognition, and revelation increases where it is received. What you have called common has never been empty, it has only been unrecognized, because the danger of familiarity is not that it removes value, but that it hides it. And today what you have walked past, lived with, tolerated, and assumed was ordinary is being separated for purpose, because God has never needed a temple built by hands to move. He has always chosen the places people overlook, the spaces people underestimate, the moments people rush through. And the reason He does this is so that no one can say it was the place itself that carried the power, but the presence that entered it. There are objects in your house, routines in your day, conversations in your life that you assumed were neutral, neither good nor bad, just there. But heaven does not see neutral the way humanity does, because what seems neutral to you is often strategic to God, and what you called insignificant has been positioned as a point of contact. Because consecration does not require perfection, it requires availability. And availability is often found in the ordinary places where pride is absent and expectations are low. In the scriptures, God took staffs, jars, stones, tables, doors, and meals and turned them into instruments of divine action, not because they were special, but because He chose them. And today follows the same pattern, because God does not change His ways, only the settings. And what you thought was just part of life is about to carry weight, not because it changed, but because heaven assigned it meaning. You must understand that consecration is not about removing something from life, but about returning it to its original purpose. Because everything was created to point back to God. And when something is consecrated, it realigns with that purpose. And suddenly what was draining becomes life, giving. What was heavy becomes light. What was confusing becomes clear, because alignment releases flow. There are rooms in your house that have absorbed words spoken in frustration, fear, doubt, and wariness. And there are rooms that have heard laughter, hope, and prayer. And today the atmosphere is being addressed. Because God does not only work in events, He works in environments, and when he consecrates a space, he does not erase its history, he redeems it, transforming what was spoken into what will be released. You may not see fire fall, you may not hear a voice from heaven, but you may sense a stillness, a pause, a weight that causes you to stop and reflect, because consecration often begins with awareness, and awareness is the doorway to change, because once you realize that God is present, you can no longer live as though he is absent. What you eat at, what you sit on, what you wake up to, what you return to at night is not disconnected from your spiritual life. Because God never separated the sacred from the everyday, humanity did, and today that division is being challenged. Because when God consecrates the common, he restores the truth that all of life belongs to him. There are habits you labeled as harmless, patterns you called normal, cycles you accepted as unchangeable. And today light begins to fall on them, not to condemn, but to redefine, because consecration exposes not to shame, but to heal, and what is healed no longer controls, because healing breaks agreement with limitation. Understand this, consecration does not always feel dramatic. Sometimes it feels like conviction, sometimes like peace, sometimes like an urge to change something small, but small changes in consecrated spaces produce lasting impact, because obedience in the ordinary carries more power than sacrifice in the extraordinary. God often begins by claiming what is already yours, because surrender is easier when it starts with what feels manageable, and once the ordinary is yielded, the extraordinary follows, because trust grows in stages, and today is a stage, not the destination, a moment where what you thought was yours alone is being acknowledged as shared ground with heaven. There are sounds in your house that have become background noise, voices you tune out, moments you rush past. But today attentiveness becomes an act of worship, because to notice is to honor, and to honor is to invite more. And what you honor determines what increases, because God responds to recognition. This is why today matters, because what is consecrated today will influence tomorrow. And what is ignored today will repeat itself, because time does not heal what awareness refuses to confront, and consecration is confrontation wrapped in grace, because it invites you to see differently rather than live blindly. Your house does not need to change address to change assignment. It needs alignment, and alignment begins when the common is no longer dismissed, because God has always hidden his greatest movements inside what people call ordinary. Waiting for the moment when eyes are opened and hearts are ready. Waiting for the moment when the familiar becomes holy and the overlooked becomes chosen and the everyday becomes a doorway where heaven continues to move without announcement, without interruption, without retreat. Nothing that enters your day does so without passing through an unseen order first, because what appears to you as interruption is often instruction in disguise. And what you label as disruption is frequently alignment taking place beyond your awareness. Because heaven does not operate in chaos, even when it disturbs your schedule, and God does not arrive randomly even when his timing feels inconvenient. Because behind every moment is a structure you cannot see, a sequence already arranged, a purpose already assigned. There are interruptions that feel like obstacles, delays that feel like resistance, conversations that feel unnecessary, moments that feel misplaced. Yet the unseen order of God often works by rearranging what you thought was fixed. Because if everything went according to your plan, you would never notice his. And if every door opened when you wanted it to, you would mistake control for blessing. And so God allows interruption not to frustrate you, but to reposition you. What you must understand is that interruption is often the language of redirection, because God rarely shouts when he can nudge, and he rarely breaks down doors when he can change your route. And what feels like something going wrong is sometimes something being prevented, because protection often looks like delay before it looks like deliverance, and wisdom often arrives disguised as inconvenience. In the scriptures, divine interruptions changed destinies. Journeys were paused, plans were halted, paths were altered, not because people failed, but because heaven intervened. Because when God interrupts, he does so with intention, not impulse. And the interruption itself becomes the message, because it forces you to look up, to slow down, to question what you assumed was necessary. There are moments today that will not fit your expectation, moments that do not align with your routine, moments that feel out of place, but nothing is out of place in the unseen order, because God sees the end from the beginning, and what you experience as confusion is often coordination, happening beyond your sight, because alignment is rarely comfortable when it is happening. The unseen order does not eliminate choice, it reveals it, because when interruption arrives, response is required. And response exposes posture, because resistance reveals attachment, frustration reveals dependence, and humility reveals trust. And what you do in the moment of interruption determines whether alignment completes its work or remains unfinished. Understand this: heaven values your attention more than your speed, because awareness is the doorway to obedience, and obedience is the pathway to blessing. And when interruption slows you down, it is often because God is adjusting what speed would have caused you to miss, because arrival without alignment produces emptiness, but alignment before arrival produces fulfillment. What you call inconvenience today may be insulation. What you call setback may be setup. What you call confusion may be protection, because God often hides mercy inside mystery and purpose inside pause. And if you rush through the interruption, you will miss what was meant to be imparted within it. There is an order behind the timing of your encounters. The words you overhear, the messages that reach you at unexpected moments, because nothing reaches you without permission, and nothing is allowed without intention. And today carries moments that are positioned not to harm you, but to instruct you, not to delay you, but to direct you. When the unseen order is at work, it often exposes what was misaligned, priorities shift, values are questioned, attachments surface. And this exposure is not condemnation, it is correction. Because God corrects what He intends to keep, and He interrupts what He intends to refine. You may feel today that things are not flowing, that progress feels slower, that clarity feels distant. But unseen order is not measured by speed, it is measured by accuracy, because arriving late in alignment is safer than arriving early out of position. And God would rather slow your steps than allow you to walk confidently in the wrong direction. Pay attention to what interrupts you today, because it carries information. Pay attention to what resists you today, because it carries instruction. Pay attention to what redirects you today, because it carries purpose. And what you discern in these moments will determine whether you partner with the unseen order or struggle against it. This is not a day of accident. It is a day of arrangement, not a day of randomness, but a day of alignment. And the unseen order working behind what you cannot control is inviting you to trust what you cannot see, because faith is not believing everything will go your way. It is believing that God is at work even when it doesn't. And the interruption you face today is not the end of movement. It is the moment where movement changes direction and meaning and weight and outcome. What remains in a house after a divine moment is never determined by the moment itself, but by the response that follows it, because revelation without response fades, and awareness without action dissolves back into familiarity. And this is why heaven does not only reveal, it waits, because God honors human choice even when divine purpose is clear, and what you do with what is shown determines what stays. Every visitation carries responsibility, because light demands a decision. And once something is revealed, you can no longer claim innocence, because knowledge changes accountability. And this is where many moments are lost, not because God did not move, but because the response was delayed, softened, or avoided, because hesitation feels safer than obedience. Yet safety without obedience slowly becomes stagnation. Your response does not need to be dramatic, but it must be deliberate, because heaven responds to alignment, not emotion. And tears without change do not sustain transformation. And excitement without commitment evaporates, because what remains after today depends on what you are willing to adjust, release, confront, or realign once the moment passes. There are things God reveals that ask for subtraction before addition, because not everything can remain where presence dwells. And when God enters a house, some patterns become uncomfortable, some habits feel exposed, some attitudes feel heavy, not because God is harsh, but because light and darkness cannot comfortably coexist, and your response determines which one you allow to remain. Understand this clearly. God will not compete with what you refuse to release, because He does not force space. He fills space that is yielded. And when something is revealed today, it is not merely to inform you, but to invite you into agreement, because agreement gives permission, and permission sustains presence. What remains is shaped by consistency, not moments, because a single response can open a door, but repeated response keeps it open. And this is why small daily decisions matter more than large emotional ones, because alignment maintained is more powerful than alignment discovered, and the house becomes a witness not of what happened once, but of what was honored repeatedly. If your response is to explain away, minimize, or delay, the moment will pass without fruit. But if your response is to adjust posture, language, attention, and obedience, the atmosphere begins to settle into something new, something lasting, something that reshapes how the house feels, how conversations flow, how peace rests. God does not ask for perfection in response, only sincerity, because willingness sustains what fear resists and humility preserves what pride pushes away. And when your response is honest, even if incomplete, grace supplies what discipline has not yet formed. There are responses that invite continuation and responses that signal closure, and heaven reads them clearly, because what you return to after revelation speaks louder than what you felt during it. And this is why today matters beyond today, because what you choose to normalize after this moment determines whether the shift deepens or disappears. What remains is not always visible immediately, because spiritual residue settles quietly, shaping tone, shaping thought, shaping reaction, shaping direction. And over time the house reflects what was welcomed, because environments are shaped by repeated agreement, not isolated encounters. Your response today becomes a boundary, because boundaries determine access, and what you guard determines what stays, and what you tolerate determines what grows. Because neutrality always sides with what already exists, and without intentional response, old patterns naturally reclaim territory. This is why response is worship, because worship is agreement expressed through action, and action seals what words alone cannot sustain. And when your response aligns with what was revealed, the house becomes a place where presence lingers, direction clarifies, and movement continues without announcement, without force, without resistance.